Hi, thank you for joining us as we explore part 5 of our series on 1 Timothy. So today we're looking at 1 Timothy chapter 5, and I've really been loving exploring this book and the realization that this is a really personal letter from Paul to Timothy. It's not one that was intended to be read to the whole church or to large groups of people, but actually it was from Paul to Timothy. So Paul is really honest and direct with him. He's talking about really specific issues that Timothy is facing within the church and that he's having to deal with. And so there's a real kind of straightforwardness and an honesty, and he doesn't need to try and sugarcoat it at all for the audience. It's just for Timothy, and he knows Timothy and Timothy knows him. And I think there's a real loveliness in kind of taking it in that context. So as we approach chapter 5, we're looking specifically at one issue for a large part of this that has come up obviously for the church at Ephesus. But Paul begins by just setting a scene of how community works together, how church works together. And it's that real culture of honouring each other. He talks about how you never speak harshly to an older man, but appeal to him respectfully as you would to your own father. Talk to younger men as you would to your own brothers. Treat older women as you would your mother, and treat younger women with all your purity as you would your own sisters. That real respect and dignity and honour that we treat one another with. And it's from this place Paul then steps into talking about a particular ministry that the church is facing, the ministry of the widows. And he starts by making something really clear. And that's that it's not just the church's responsibility. And it's really easy sometimes to think that making a difference or helping people or changing things, particularly for those who are poor or vulnerable or particularly forgotten, that's someone else's job, that charity's really good at that, or that church has a really good ministry for that. And Paul says, no, that's not the case. He says, take care of any widow who has no one else to take care of her. But if she has children or grandchildren, their first responsibility is to show godliness at home and to take care of them. So it's not just the church's responsibility. Actually, it's all of ours. For the people who are close to us, who are around us, our families, our neighbours, those who are most in need, we have a responsibility as individuals to take care of people and to step in when there's a need. It's not just saying it's up to someone else to do the job. But then Paul goes on to explore this ministry for the widows that's been going on. And there's quite a few different particulars that crop up. But overall, underneath it all, what I've really discovered as I've been exploring this is this real sense of God's purpose for people. No one is simply pushed to one side. No one's kind of had their day and they're just forgotten, or they're just going to be receivers for the rest of their life. We are all called with a purpose, with something to give, regardless of the situation we find ourselves in. And in Paul's time, in Timothy's time, widows would have had very little left to give when, in the eyes of society, they would have owned no property, they would have had very little money, except what was provided for them by their family. They were dependent on family and people around them to support them. But actually what Paul is saying is that's not just it. So he goes on in verse 5, he says, a true widow, a woman who is truly alone in this world, has placed her hope in God. She prays night and day, asking God for help. She's a woman of prayer. This woman who maybe has been written off by the world, who, you know, what will be the rest of the day. She's just going to be receiving money and help and support. She doesn't have anything to give. Here is a woman of prayer. And the really beautiful example we see in the New Testament is the example of Anna, who was one of the first people to recognise Jesus as a baby, someone who devoted her life to prayer. God had a purpose for her, despite the fact that her husband had died after only 7 years of marriage. God had a purpose. And Paul is saying here, these women still have a purpose. God has a calling for them. And then he goes on to talk about a group of women in verse 9. He says, a widow is put on the list for support. So it seems to be that there is a group of women within the church. And the context, as you look at it, there seems to be some sort of arrangement where widowed women could come and support the church, maybe do a bit of work for the church, and they would receive financial support as a result. A bit like an informal kind of employment. And Paul is saying, actually, there are some standards for this. This isn't just for anyone. This is a calling for specific women who fit this picture. This is women that have been called for this purpose. And he gives really specific criteria. These women have a role to play. And then again, he goes on to talk about younger widows, and verses 11 to 15, they read quite harsh. And it talks about being lazy and gossiping, and losing devotion to Jesus. And it can feel like Paul's writing them off a little bit. But actually what Paul is saying, he's saying, don't just let these women be pushed to one side and forever just be in receipt of the odd gift, or we just give them stuff, but actually we don't want anything from them. These women still have something to give. They are still a part of our society. They still have a purpose. And if we don't have purpose, we lose our way. That's true for any of us. Any of us, if we lose vision, if we lose purpose, we can easily become lazy. We easily slip into poor habits. We easily become self-centered. We lose the focus of Jesus. And so Jesus is saying, Paul is saying even here, these women still have a purpose. Don't let them lose sight of that. Don't let them slip just into thinking they've got nothing to give. They do have something to give. And I think this is a real challenge when we work with people, when we support people, when we come alongside people who maybe feel they've been forgotten, maybe are poor or broken or struggling or hurt and abandoned, is as we care for people and love people and provide for people, is the balance between creating a dependency so that actually we stop people moving forward, or loving people and caring for people and equipping people so that they can be released into freedom and into the fullness that God has for them. The purposes that he had for them when he created them, the designs and the plans when they were formed and birthed. And Jesus was always really good at that. He saw people, he knew their circumstances and their situations, and he healed them. He loved them, and then he released them and he said, go to whatever the situation was. Go and tell people, go and share, go and do this. You don't stay as a dependent. I love that. God releases people into freedom because each human being has a purpose and a plan that God has put in them and on their lives. So that's this first half of the chapter, just talking about how we care for people with purpose, how we have a role in this as individuals, not just kind of the church or a charity or a organisation. We have a role to play. And then it goes on to talk about leadership again, and this comes up a few times through Timothy. So there's a real emphasis on the importance of the leaders and supporting the leaders. Paul's really clear in what he expects from leadership within the church. And again, it's this recognition of purpose and calling. These people who have been called to lead the church have a purpose, and particularly in verses 17 through to 18, it talks about how we honour and respect and treat these people. It goes on with some really specific directions in how we support people, how we support leaders particularly and encourage them, how we hold people accountable, the standards that we have and expect. But ultimately, it is that sense of honouring and of equipping and releasing people, believing in people, knowing that they have a purpose, and not allowing people to fall from that and just settle for something less. And in the midst of all this kind of beautiful instruction that Paul is giving Timothy about the church, I love there's this little verse in verse 23. It's like Paul remembers something. He's like, oh, I've got to write this down before I forget it. You know, when you find the random note on your phone that you had to jot down because you would have forgotten it otherwise. This is one of those. He suddenly says, don't drink only water. You ought to drink a little wine for the sake of your stomach because you are sick so often. And water then would often have been quite contaminated and not everyone's stomachs would have adjusted. And so Paul's just remembering, like, don't take care of yourself, Timothy, actually. In the midst of all of this learning and all the work that you're doing, make sure you take care of yourself as well. And I love that because it just really humanises it. So hopefully you'll be able to unpack this chapter a little bit together, explore what you get out of it. And this has maybe given a couple of starting points. But I've left a couple of questions for you just to think about, particularly if you'd like to. So firstly, how do we as a church honour one another? How do we treat one another with respect? Are we good at that? How could we be better at it? How do we honour one another? And then secondly, and this has two parts to it. Firstly, do you know your purpose? Do you feel like you're living with purpose? Or are you kind of sliding through life? Is there a risk that you've lost your purpose? So that's the first part of the second question. The second part is, where and how can we call that out in people around us? How do we see people's purpose? How do we see the God-given gifts within them? Are there ways that we can encourage one another in that? Are there maybe times that actually we find that really hard to see in other people? How can we encourage one another in that? And then finally, I'd just like you as a group to really spend just a couple of minutes praying for our church leadership. They work really hard and I think they do an amazing job, but it's hard and I think we should be praying for them. So maybe just a couple of minutes at the end, spend time praying for the leaders of our church. So I hope you enjoy unpacking that. If you disagree or have any thoughts or comments, I would love to hear them. I don't profess to be an expert, but I'm always up for learning more. But thank you for your time and enjoy your time together.